Hello everyone, I'm Kenan and this is Fiction Friday. It's going to be a weekly fiction workshop that focuses on aspects of craft. So what I'll be doing is doing small little talks like this on a particular aspect of short fiction predominantly, since we won't really have time to get into longer fiction. So what that means though is these are going to be pre-recorded, so they won't be live like some of the other workshops we have going on. But I still invite you to ask your questions in the comments below because I'll be online answering questions as the video is playing, and you can always ask questions long after the video is posted, and I'll do my best to answer any questions up there. At the end of these videos, I will have prompts that I'll post in the comments section, sort of little writing exercises. I do invite you to go ahead and write your responses in the comments section as well. So that way we can sort of create a writing community. People can see what other people are working on. We can offer constructive feedback or even just say, we really liked it. I know I'll be doing that. I won't be writing anything, but I'll be there making comments on any stories people post. Right, so let's get started on today's topic. For this week, we'll be exploring point of view. POV, as it's also called. I think it's one of the most underrated or at least underanalyzed aspects of a short story, especially because people sort of get it in their heads that they have an understanding of it already. So they sort of skip over it, they don't take it very seriously. They don't consider it as something to develop as part of their story as they do setting or character or dialogue. But I argue that you can't even do those if you don't have a strong foundation with point of view. So let's go ahead and define point of view. I have my notes here, so I'll look down pretty frequently. So point of view, POV, is often thought of as the narrator of a story. But more accurately, it's actually just the lens or the vantage point through which a story is told to the audience, either a reader or a character. So POV, or point of view, is usually thought of as the narrator of a story, but more accurately, it's just the vantage point from which a story is told. So point of view can be from technically 6 different aspects, although really more just 4. And this can be broken down into the grammatical structures of first person, plural and singular, second person, plural and singular, and third person, plural and singular. Although really for second and third person, those are more just grammatical rather than craft aspects that you can take control of. For first person, there's the plural and singular, where the speaker is a first person, either individual or a first person entire community. I've also even seen first person where it's a group of trees. So there's a lot of different ways you can do plural and singular for that. But for third person, it's just what you're referencing. So it would be like he, she, it, and then they. And that's more just grammar rather than craft. And second person is you versus you all. And that's really more just grammar rather than craft. Although I suppose you could make the case that second person plural is more addressing a major audience rather than addressing an individual. So it really depends on what you're doing. These 6, or rather 4, can then also be broken down into a few different things. So first person has singular and plural, as I said, but there's also reliable and unreliable, and then there's peripheral and central. So there's a number of different ways you can do first person, and we'll get down into what makes them tick and how they work and what they are in a moment. But moving on, second person has singular and plural, as I said. There's not really any sort of defined aspects or components or subdivisions as there are for first person and third person for second person, just because it's a little bit more experimental, it's not very frequently done, and it is actually a little bit more rigid in what you can do with it when you do choose to implement it. Third person, on the other hand, is broken up into 3 distinct categories, and those are omniscient, limited omniscient, and observational or objective. So there's third person omniscient, third person omniscient limited, and third person objective or observable. And we'll get into those as well in just a moment. So today, these building blocks for point of view are what I'm really going to be discussing. I'll be breaking down first person into its 4 categories: reliable, unreliable, peripheral, and central, which you can use a combination of those two aspects in different tandems. And then I'll be talking about third persons, 3 different aspects, and how to kind of employ these, what they look like in development. But mostly we'll be talking about what they are and some examples of them and how they work. I won't be talking about second person too much just because it's not very commonly used, and it's more like an intuition thing, and I just don't have the intuition for it. Third person, though not the oldest type of narrative, because probably the first stories were about ourselves, and we come home and we say, today this is what I did. I beat off a stegosaurus, and I returned to the cave, and I cooked some stegosaurus meat. But third person probably followed soon after. Either way, though, third person is considered sort of the most conventional method of storytelling. It certainly has an air of the epic, especially when you do sort of distanced or very omniscient third person. You think about the Bible, you think of epics, you think of the Odyssey, although you can make a case about the Odyssey. But these are all sort of very aloof, very high up narrators, you could call them. Essentially, it's God talking to us, the audience. Although first person might be sort of the natural way to tell a story, certainly it's the most natural way for oral storytelling. Third person has pretty much been established as the conventional or most conventional method of telling a story. It's really more formal than the other methods. There's a distance, there's an understanding that whoever is speaking has some authority, depending on, whether it's omniscient or limited omniscient. If it's omniscient, the speaker is really pretty much just God. So there's a lot of authority there. And we take everything for granted as truth. And there's sort of a long history of why this was the way to tell a story, mostly for the ease of access for a lot of different viewpoints. So a storyteller could write a story and say, this is what John thought, and this is what Emily felt, and this is what Ryan felt, and this is what Peggy thought, and back and forth. It can access just about anybody's mind, just about anybody's feelings, and just about anybody's actions. So it can traverse time and space. It can traverse the nebulous of consciousness. It's a pretty easy form to use to get to everything. There is complete access in third person, but only if it's third person omniscient. So actually there's the 3 main types of third person are omniscient, limited omniscient, and observable. So omniscient is when the narrator is God and kind of looks at everything, sees everything, feels everything, hears everything, knows all of the thoughts, knows all the truths. Anything that they speak is taken as a truth. So, you can make sort of blanket statements. You could be Nietzsche and making some really strange claims about human nature. But as long as it's third person omniscient, we sort of take that as the truth of at least the world in the story, maybe not our world, although sometimes we do take it as the truth of our world. And then third person omniscient limited still has a lot of that power, but there's a couple of different ways that power works out. So there's access to maybe one character instead of all of the characters' thoughts and feelings, but they can still see everything. This is really common, especially in like YA books. It adds sort of a level of ease to be able to tell a story from multiple different viewpoints without actually having to get into multiple different characters' heads. So it becomes a little bit more personal. The main character, it becomes a little bit more obvious because it's the character whose thoughts we get. But we don't sacrifice that sort of ability for the narrator to know everything that's going on. Even if they don't know everything that everybody's feeling and thinking, they can still tell the story whether or not the main character is there. But we really only get the interiority of the main character. That's not always the case. Sometimes it's 2, 3, 4. It's limited only if it's not access to everybody. And it's not so much that like every tiny little character has to get an interiority for it to be considered omniscient. But if most of the characters who do any of the heavy lifting are getting interiorities directly reported to us from the narrator, then the narrator is pretty much God, and that's omniscience. Limited omniscience, like I said, more just one person. And it's not as traditional as the, biblical sort of third-person omniscient, but it has a very long history as well. And it's also a little bit more conventional than first person, but it does offer a lot of the benefits of the personability and the humanity that first person offers. So it becomes really more of a centralized story. Feelings and emotions can be a little bit more expressive. That's not right. Feelings and emotions are more relatable, I suppose, because it's harder to get access to others. Things have to be shown to us. So unlike third person omniscient, we only get the interiority of one. In limited, but third person omniscient reports all action, goes into any character's minds, interprets the character for the reader, moves through time and space, and can focus the lens from action, from the atom to the cosmos. So it's everywhere. Limited is these powers, but in a somewhat smaller capacity. So maybe it just can't traverse time and space, but we can get all the characters' interiority. Or maybe we can only get one character's interiority, but we can go all the way back to their past and remember things that they can't remember, but that they were there for. So like birth, I suppose. There's all sorts of different ways you can limit third-person omniscience so that it becomes limited omniscient, and it really just depends on the kind of story that you're going to tell. But by and large, the most common element of omniscient limited is the objective reportage of the world around them, and then the interiority of a single character. Lastly, there is the objective third person, or the observable third person. It's not so much that we see the third person, it's just that we can only see, or rather, the narrator can only narrate what anybody could experience in that situation. So I think of Ernest Hemingway a lot when I think of this type of story. It's very much, let's just report the facts, and we're not going to go inside anybody's head, and we're not going to make any judgments about the way they spoke their dialogue. It's just very subtle. It's sort of a young couple sits at a table, they order a beer, woman looks pregnant, man's kind of upset, and that's like Hills for White Elephants. And we sort of slowly learn that the story is about an abortion, but it's all inferred. And there are some interesting things you can do with this type of narrator, or rather point of view. It's very subtle, so the drawback is that you have to really rely on your audience's intellect. The good news is short story readers are generally the smartest readers out there. It's a really nice thing, so go ahead and appreciate it. Best readers are short story readers, but they're generally pretty smart and they can sort of infer what's going on. But then the hard work for you is not to pass any judgment and make sure you include the right details. So it's all about knowing what details will express what. Maybe it's the way someone has comported themselves in their attire. Maybe they're at an interview, but they have a short sleeve shirt on under their suit jacket instead of a long sleeve shirt with their tie, and that might throw somebody off. You can't guarantee that the audience is going to get what you meant by that, but they're going to get something out of it. And it sort of paints a picture, and it lets the audience sort of create more of the story in themselves rather than letting the story be told to them. So it's a little bit similar to first person in the way that there's a distance between what we can learn about the outside world versus what we can learn about the character through what they see. Another way to think of the three distinctions of third-person point of view is through something called free indirect speech. So there's three types of speech. There's direct speech, indirect speech, and free indirect speech. So direct speech is quotations, "I love ice cream," end quotations, "he said." That's pretty standard. The speech is reported to us. Indirect speech would be something more along the lines of summarized dialogue, where you would say, he said he loved ice cream. That's indirect speech. No quotations, but he loves ice cream is reported as what was said. Pretty straightforward. Free indirect speech is a little different. So instead of having the dialogue directly reported, or even the thoughts sort of directly reported, it's something a little bit along the lines of a character is sitting there watching another character eat ice cream. So let's say the narration goes a little bit like this. John was eating ice cream. Mint chocolate chip. Mint chocolate chip is delicious. And that's sort of the interiority of the character who's watching John eat. It's third person, technically, because we didn't get an I. If it was, I think mint chocolate chip is delicious, then that would be indirect speech because they're not saying it out loud. They're just thinking it, and we get the interiority. But in third person, for it to be free indirect speech, is sort of like the interiority directly put into our thoughts as a quotation without quotation marks. It's sometimes a little bit confusing, and I didn't do a super great job of describing it, but you'll sort of figure it out. The way then this breaks up are three types of third person. Omniscient third person can do free indirect speech for any character. Limited omniscience can do free indirect speech, but only for like one or two characters. And then observational or objective third person cannot do free indirect speech. That would give us interiority that not the layman could get to. So that was third person point of view. A little wordy, but generally third person point of view can be summarized as any story that's told with he said, or she did, or they went, and that's the narration. There's no I, there's no you. There can be, but that's sort of the general rule is that's what third person point of view is. So we're done with third person. Second person, I'm going to touch on really briefly, just because I would feel weird not talking about it. It's the most experimental type, like I said, and it's usually reserved for an effect. And the effect generally right now, there's a trend in using second person as a way to humanize trauma. So especially with like migrant fiction or victims of violence, there's a way that they can do second person to make the reader feel as if the situation had occurred to them, and it really humanizes aspects and it makes things super relatable. The problem is if you have a reader who's not very open-minded, they're just going to shut it down. They're not going to relate, and you know, whether or not it's actually relatable is up for debate. More relatable, I suppose, than the others. I think it's just a matter of good writing makes the emotions very relatable. There's a couple of different types of second person. Lorrie Moore does, I think she has a pretty funny piece about being a writer, and the reader is a writer, and they say, you are a writer, blah, blah, blah. It's pretty good, but I think my favorite is Italo Calvino's novel, If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler. So this novel is sort of about the relationships between reader, writer, and characters. And it starts with, you are getting comfortable and you just opened up the latest book by Italo Calvino called If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler. And then it transitions back and forth. So the whole thing isn't in second person, but you become a character who's a character reading the novel while you're reading the novel about you reading a novel. It gets kind of weird, but it's really fun. So on to first person. First person is the point of view with perhaps the most moving parts. Second person is pretty straightforward, although not always easy to understand. Third person only has three sort of subdivisions, and they're pretty easily defined. The first person has a couple different things going on. So like I said, there's peripheral and central. And this is really easy to figure out. So a peripheral character in the first person point of view is a character who's part of the story, but the story's not really about them. They're the ones reporting the story, so they're saying, I went and did this, I went and saw that. But the story's not really about them. It's about their experience watching somebody else's story unfold. The most famous example of this is Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby. So what he's doing, he's a peripheral character. He's observing the life of Jay Gatsby and his cousin Daisy. And he's sort of taking part in it, but he's not the main mover. And the story is really about Gatsby. So the other type of first person, of the two main types, central and peripheral, is central. And that's really most contemporary literary novels are first person central. So that's going to be any narrator where they're saying I and the story's about them. That's very straightforward. And like I said, that's almost all contemporary literary fiction. It's not going to be all contemporary fiction. There's a lot of mystery, a lot of sci-fi, a lot of fantasy that does third person. And that's for different reasons. But most literary fiction where interiority is the main storyline rather than exterior plot. Interior plot and conflict and development is really big, and first person central really lends itself to this because you're less concerned with what's going on in the world outside of the person as you are with their responses to the world outside of them. And like I said, first person, perfect for that. When discussing central and peripheral, though, there's something really important to keep in mind. And that's kind of been called Hill's Law. And I'll go ahead and I got a passage here I can show you about that. It's from Rust Hills in his book, Writing in General and the Short Story in Particular. He sort of talks about how central and peripheral doesn't really matter as a distinction because the character telling the story is the one who we have to care about the most anyway, and their emotional change. So let's see right here. This, I believe, Hill says, is what will always be the case in successful fiction, that either the character moved by the action will become the point of view character, or else the point of view character will become the character moved by the action. And he says, call it Hill's Law. So let's go ahead and break this down. What he means by that is whoever's telling the story is going to be the one moved by the central action, or the central action moving the character is the one who has to tell the story. So that still holds up with the Gatsby example because Nick Carraway is the one I would say who's most affected by all the changes, unless you want to go ahead and say that death is the most effective change in a person's life. And of course, then Jay Gatsby is dead. Sorry for the spoiler. But Nick Carraway, he sort of has become very disillusioned with everything. And he's definitely forsworn sort of that life that he was trying to get into in the beginning. So I think it still holds up. And I think there's a lot of peripheral characters out there in the world who are the ones changing. This is especially true in like children as narrators in fiction. You know, the world outside of them is what's at stake. And, you know, generally a lot of the action is going to happen in the world outside of them, but they're the ones sort of being influenced by this, experiencing either the trauma or the majesty of youth, and it sort of affects them in ways that the other actions aren't really going to affect people. And I have a pretty good example of that too I'll get to in just a moment. Let me put my book away. So we have central and peripheral, but we also have reliable and unreliable narrators. So reliable narrators are common for fiction, in part because of the social contract that we have as readers with writers. You know, you pick up a book and there's the social contract of everything in this book, though a fiction, is true. I'm going to tell you the truth. And we sort of say, okay, yes, I will suspend my disbelief. I will accept that this is a fiction, but I will take it as truth. So sort of the default is a reliable narrator, and this is especially true in third person. That's why I'm not really breaking down third person into reliable and unreliable, just because third person is so much more omniscient that it kind of has the forcefulness that it can't be unreliable. Whereas in first person, anybody can be telling us this story, so there's some wiggle room. So reliable narrators are narrators that we can trust about most things. You know, everyone has a blind spot. So if a character has one blind spot, that doesn't make them an unreliable narrator as they're telling us the story. But it's definitely a spectrum. A lot of people think of it as black and white. Someone's either reliable or an unreliable narrator, and I think that's not true. like most things in life, there's a big long spectrum. You know, you're going to say that sort of the average character, first person telling us a story is pretty reliable. And then maybe a child telling us a story is a little less reliable. They might report the things as they're happening well, but their sort of interpretation of events might be a little off, or they might not get the nuance. And there's dramatic irony that comes out of that where we get the nuance, but they don't. And so that kind of creates some tension. And that's how an unreliable narrator can help create tension. And then there's like the really unreliable narrators, such as bigots, there's liars, there's schizophrenics. You know, these are very common unreliable narrators in situations. And they make really interesting fiction, but that's because they play with our understanding of what we can take as truth and what we have to hit with skepticism. There's some really good examples of this. Let's see. So, like I said, stories with children as a narrator are probably the best example of an unreliable narrator. And my favorite is Graham Greene's The Fallen Idol. It's about a butler for a consulate, I think, who's taking care of this boy while the dad is away on embassy business. But the butler's having an affair, and the boy idolizes this butler. And the butler's wife goes out of town as well, so the butler and the boy are alone in the embassy, and the butler starts going out and seeing this lady. But the boy thinks it's his niece, I believe, so he doesn't quite get everything. And then when the wife returns, there's a lot of tension, and she suspects stuff, but she's trying to get the boy to admit something. But he doesn't know what he's not supposed to admit, and he's trying to protect the butler, but he doesn't understand the complex world of adulthood. So there's tension all around, and it's a great situation where the narrator is unreliable because he doesn't really get everything. So we're sort of piecing in the puzzles, and there's a lot of dramatic irony in this. Another really good example is Huck Finn as the narrator in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, because, you know, it's not just that he's a little bit of a shady character. He's not really a shady character, but, you know, he's what everybody considers the ruffian, the bad boy, the vagabond kind of running around, the wild child. And he sees himself as this too. But he has a pretty strong moral compass, so he's always selling himself a little bit short. So he's sort of painting his own actions in a negative light, where then he starts painting actions by Tom Sawyer, who everybody regards as a hero, or at least in his eyes, as heroic, as educated. But we know from reading Tom Sawyer, and also knowing about Tom Sawyer through the story, that Tom's not actually super educated. He's not super enlightened. So there's distance there, and there's dramatic irony there in the way that a character can treat themselves that makes them unreliable if they don't have faith in their telling, even though we know that they should. That's another form of unreliable narrator. And then, of course, there's unreliable narrators where they're just lunatics or murderers or what have you. I can't remember if American Psycho is in first person or not. If it is, though, that's a really good example of an unreliable narrator. Why you would do that is probably to expose the ironies behind what makes a person that way, especially with situations where it's perhaps a bigot in a situation, and you know, you're making them the focal character just to highlight sort of the irony of their bigotry. It works pretty well, but I think there are better ways, and I don't really ever recommend that type of unreliable narrator, just because I don't know, it feels kind of. And then the other two types of first person point of view that you can break first person down into is singular and plural. And most first person stories are going to be told in first person singular. And that's just the standard, you know, Nick Carraway, Huck Finn, Graham Greene's Fallen Idol, I can't remember the boy's name. All of my examples have been first person singular. The Stranger, I mean, it's just so many of them are first person singular. But, so I'm not even going to really talk about it, but first person plural is something else. And it's a little interesting, and I actually really like it. I find it fascinating. first person plural kind of operates as the Greek chorus in old plays, where it's a group of people observing something, and we get their interiority as a collective social unit. The most famous example is probably A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner, where it's the village or town. It's the town telling the story of Emily and her deceased husband, if I'm remembering correctly. And it gives you some interiority, and the story is about Emily, but we start to learn a lot about the town through the way that they tell the story. And we start to learn about the situation surrounding everything. I think it works pretty well. I don't think it's the best example. It's certainly the most famous. My favorite example of first person plural is a story called The Strange Career of Dr. Raju Gopalarajan, Dr. Raju Gopalarajan by Rajesh Parameshwaran. He's one of my favorite authors. He's a short story writer. And this is a story about a couple of immigrants who moved to the United States from India. And it's told from the point of view of the families back in India who knew them, as this doctor sort of starts undergoing less than legal medical practices. And we learn a lot about how immigrants are viewed by those who stay behind, who don't immigrate. We learn a lot about sort of the social pressures. We learn about social castes, hierarchies, elitisms. I mean, it's a really in-depth story, but it's very subtly done. There's not a whole lot of instances of the we aspect in telling a first-person plural story. I think it starts with something along the lines of we all thought this about the doctor, or maybe it's in the first page, but it's very subtle and it only appears a couple times, but I do think it's the best example of it. It's a phenomenal story. Definitely check it out. So those are the three main types: point of view: first, second, and third. And we've broken third down into omniscient, limited omniscient, and objective, and first into either singular or plural, but more importantly, either central or peripheral. But equally important aspect of point of view isn't just who's telling the story, but who is hearing the story. So the audience is a really crucial part of deciding how you're going to tell the story. Who's the intended audience? And there's a couple of different things, because an intended audience isn't always just the reader. For epistolary stories, the intended audience is another character. So let's look at a couple of the different audiences. So the first audience I have written down here is the reader. An intelligent folk, sort of contented by the social contract of reading. So they're open-minded, they give you the benefit of the doubt because they've engaged in the social contract that we all engage in when we open a book, and that is to let the author tell the story without interruption and without disbelief. If the author is really shoddy, though, they've forfeited the contract, so it's null and void, and we don't have to read it without disbelief. If the author is convincing, though, we give them the benefit of the doubt, and the reader does this. They say, okay, I will go ahead and suspend my disbelief here, and you go ahead and tell me the story. So that's one audience that a point of view can have. Another audience member that the point of view can have is another character. So this is really big in frame novels, especially from the 18th and 19th centuries, where it's, the novel is, I heard this on a boat coming back from Africa, and this is what the guy said, and then the guy goes, and this is what I heard while I was in Africa about this river, and I think that was Heart of Darkness, starts like that. But any frame novel is, the audience is a different character. So a guy is telling a story on a boat to other people, but we are also the audience as the reader. But very specifically, the audience is the people on the boat listening to the story. I think it works very well. There's a contemporary novel called The Marcello Investigation. It's sort of a response to Albert Camus' The Stranger. So where Marceau in The Stranger goes around, does his stuff, kills a nameless Arab, the Marcello Investigation is from the point of view of the brother of the dead nameless Arab that Marceau kills in The Stranger. But he's telling his story to a reporter who's come around and been like, I'm investigating, you know, doing some reportive journalism. And the narrator is first person. It's the brother of the dead Arab, and he's, you know, drinking and telling the story of his brother to a reporter. So there's a couple layers going on there. It's a peripheral character. It's first person singular, but it's reportage, so the audience is another character. And that's pretty common with first person stories. The audience can be another character. It's a little bit harder to do in some other types, but first person can pull that off pretty well. There's also the self as the audience, or the diary. And that's, you know, most obvious in Bridget Jones's Diary. I think that's a pretty solid example. I mean, it's got diary in the title, but, you know, this is a novel in diary where the character is writing to themselves and they're revealing things, or they're talking to themselves and they're revealing things. Interior monologue is another form of this sort of diary type story. Even if you're just writing emails to yourself, I think I've seen that as a short story. That's the self, is the intended audience. And there's a couple of different strange things that you can do with that. You know, you can really sort of explore what it means to be alone with yourself, alone with your thoughts. You can also really break down a character's thoughts about things easier. And it can show the dichotomy and paradox of being human, because, you know, you can write one thing one day and then the next day you're having a conversation with yourself. And then, you know, this exponentially grows where you're having multiple conversations with yourself. And we can see how people change more dramatically that way. So there's a couple of reasons you would do that. The other audience is what I'm going to call the nebulous consciousness. So this is a story that's written to be read by consciousness. And you say, well, that's kind of weird. But stream of consciousness is that way. And it's not so much that it's a story we can't read, but it's purposefully written to be read as the human consciousness. So it's going to imitate the way human consciousness thinks and moves through its thoughts. So this is the intended audience then, is sort of that particular stream of consciousness, that particular human being's consciousness. And it's just a recording, and it's kind of like holding a mirror up to consciousness. That's the nebulous of consciousness. So the forms then are kind of those main ones with some subtle variations. You know, you can also think about, is this a written story or is it an oral story? And that's going to change the way you might think of your narrator. You know, a written story lends itself a little bit more to third person than an oral story does. You know, you can still do oral third person story, but, you know, being a tale teller in first person is a little bit more conventional, I think. Not necessarily easier, but certainly more recognizable. But that's about it for considering your audience. It's either going to be the reader, a character, or some form of self, I think. So first person development is the most limited. It's filtered through the known sieve of the first person character telling the story. The thought, subjectivity, and judgment, these are all the things filtering out what they know or what they're guessing at. And we can only guess or infer at the things that they reveal to us and their own inferences. But all of this depends, you know, on how much depends on the reliability of the narrator, as well as sort of their prejudices or fascinations or passions. You know, a character who's really into woodworking is going to be obsessed with the types of woods and materials, perhaps, and we just don't care. But maybe it lends themselves to sort of exploring the richness of another character's life because of the different types of woods. So there's different ways you can do development that way, but it's all going to be filtered through their experiences and their knowledge base. Characterization then is going to be mostly indirect. So instead of saying like there's John's an angry SOB, John doesn't like potatoes, you know, that's not really how it's going to happen unless, you know, John and the main character have talked and these are the things that have said. The main character is either going to guess at these things or he's going to see John violently fling potatoes off of his plate, and constantly go into bouts of rage. He could summarize pretty early, like, there's John, John's angry. But that's something that he knew already, maybe, the first person narrator. And so things that we get to learn about John as the story moves on are going to be filtered through how the first person sort of experiences John. So it's a little bit more difficult, and it's a lot more showing. So, instead of saying, like, Emily's poor, you're going to show her begging for some money, or you're going to show some slightly tattered clothes, or some other character is going to tell our narrator that they saw Emily out begging on the highway, or wore the wrong dress to a party, if it were Jane Austen, I suppose. Gossip is going to be kind of the way that they get some information, but for the most part, it's going to be a lot of showing. And perhaps this is why show, don't tell became the maxim that it is today, which is a bit unfortunate. I think there's a lot of merits to telling, but there's not a whole lot of room to tell in a first-person narrator, just because they don't have that sort of omniscient authority to make these judgment calls if the author wants us to continue reading. Otherwise, it's going to be an incredibly opinionated person. But, that works for some people. Look at Catcher in the Rye. So dialogue is another great way to characterize when you're in first person. So, the way a character interacts with another character, their exact speech is going to be, or even sometimes what they don't say, or how little they say, or the silences are going to be really revealing. And even one-way dialogue. I have an excerpt, let me pull it up, that I'd like to share with you guys of some really fantastic dialogue that does characterization. So it's from Monica McFawn's Out of the Mouth of Babes. And in this story, I think it's the babysitter, she's coming across the child talking on the phone. As she walked down the stairs, she began to make out what was being said. I see, but what if we have wood termites? You'd just leave and treat them on a second visit? When she entered the living room, she was surprised to see only the boy. He was on the phone, and the voice was coming from him. His back was turned to her, and she stopped to listen. That doesn't work. What if they multiply between the 2 visits? Then you'll get more money than if you treated them for the first time. The boy, when she listened more closely, didn't sound like a man exactly. His words began with an eager, high chip and a fuzzy pronunciation, like those of most children, but the ends of his phrases were crisp, even brittle. Within a single sentence, he ran through the vocal life cycle, sounding like both a babbling toddler and an old man, with the bass thinned out from his tone. The person on the other end of the line would have had a hard time suspecting his age, not in the least because of his penchant for hard bargaining. No, I need all the vermin taken care of in one go. I have in my hand a coupon from your competitor, Reddit, and it says here The boy was getting more and more excited. She could see him bounce on the couch as he read out the coupon in a ringing, triumphant voice. Okay then, I look forward to getting the manager's call. He hung up the phone and caught sight of her. So, in this situation, we're not getting the interiority of the child, but we're getting the way that the child is responding. So he's bouncing up and down. He's getting really excited. He's sort of trying on adult conversation. And he's also really surprising in his usage of certain words like vermin. He's got an understanding of waiting for the manager to call back, and he's pretty excited about that. So this is a way, even though it's third person, it's third person limited. So we're only really with, I think it was Monica, right? Or no, we're only with the babysitter. And we're not getting the babysitter's interiority too much, just a little bit. But we're definitely not getting the child's. We're getting all of his sort of interiority through his actions, observable, and through the dialogue that's direct dialogue. It's not, summarized. It's not coming through a filter. So that's a couple of different ways you can do characterization and stuff like that. Third person is generally unlimited in its methods of development. It can do just about anything. It can show and it can tell. It can tell a lot. It can pass a lot of judgment, and it can be, like I said, authorial. It can be God saying, like, these mortals are fools, We would say yes, of course, yes. But that's development, actually. And, it can be a little bit more subtle than that, of course. But third person affords you to be able to pass these judgments, to pass these universal truths, to claim things a little bit more. It's easier to tell a grander story, too, I think, with third person, just because of the way you can develop multiple different things swiftly. That's the big key thing, I think. There's sort of a dispensing of, or a jettisoning of the trivialities and getting straight to the point by summing up the trivial aspects pretty quickly. Whereas in first person, especially in short stories, the trivialities are kind of the subtlety of the interiority. With third person objective, on the other hand, everything is presented to the reader to interpret. There's no guessing by the narrator, there's no inferences, there's nothing, there's no interiority. It's only everything that happened as it happened, which means that you're going to have to trust your reader a lot. So all of the details matter, and they mean different things. And the biggest drawback for this one is trusting your reader to know what they mean, or at least trusting the reader to sort of guess at accurate-ish things. Ernest Hemingway, like I said, Hills with White Elephants. If you're not super into the nuances of things, you might not get that it's about a guy pressuring a woman to have an abortion. And then that story is pointless and really boring for you. And you say, why is this classic American literature? And that's fair, actually. I think that's a pretty solid point you could make. If you're relying solely on what the reader can infer, then you can't judge the reader for not enjoying something that they didn't get if you didn't put it in there properly. So it's a tough one, honestly. Objective third person for development, it's not easy. So we've talked a little bit about the different points of view, and a little bit about how to use them. Not too much, I don't have too much time, but I do want to talk about how to pick one when writing a story. I think that's a really important aspect of this whole thing about point of view, is settling on which one to use. So when you're picking one, I think there are some questions you need to keep in mind. And I'll tell you my questions here that I've got written down. You need to ask yourself first, who is telling the tale? Is it God? Is it Nick Carraway? Is it your brother? Is it, the neighbor? Is it an ant, like the insect? Is it a stand of trees? Is it the wind? These are, if they're telling the story, it's going to be different. Then you need to ask, who is listening to the tale? So who's the intended audience? Is it just the reader, or is it another character? If it's another character, it's going to be tough to do third person. You might have to settle for first person. If it's the reader, you can do first, or you can do third. If it's sort of kind of like the Bible, where it's, oh, you Christians, then you could still do third, or you could do first. But I think it depends on the kind of story. Is it epistolary, or is it reportage? Is it sort of things as they happened? Is it sort of very interior? Is it where intrigue is all about miscommunications? And then third, what form is the tale? Like I said, like I was kind of leading into, is this going to be a diary, or a letter, or a frame? Or is this just going to be kind of a story like you find a novel? It's in a book, so I decided to read it. Or is it going to be more like an imitation of oral storytelling? These are questions you got to ask yourself when considering what point of view. And then the last question is, what distance do you want the teller of the tale to have from the tale itself? And I didn't really touch on this in this video, just because it's a little small, I think, but no less important. Do you want the character telling the story? Do you want the narrator to be a character in the story, or do you want them to be an observer of the story, very aloof, or do you want them to be very far back? Do you want them to be the fourth person in a line of people who've heard this story? Do you want it to be the person at the center of the story? Do you want it to be, what do you want it to be, I guess? Thank you very much for joining me today. I'll go ahead and post some writing exercises in the comments section below. And I invite you to ask any questions that you've got below as well. If you need me to illuminate something a little bit more, I can do that. I highly recommend checking out, there's a website called Craft Literary that has a couple essays on things like this. They're really cool. They've got some really great, really smart writers doing things that I can't do and explaining it in ways that I cannot explain. So definitely check them out. Thanks for joining me and have a good one.